battlefields of the Somme. By late April, the Allies decided to hit back and counterattacked at Villers-Bretonneux on the 24th.
As soon as the news that Villers-Bretonneux was lost reached the high headquarters, orders showered down for its immediate recapture. As often happened, the lower commander had usually issued his order before that from his superior arrived. The order from General Foch, for example, came about midday, but General Rawlinson had already taken the vital measures. At 9:30 a.m., as soon as he was informed about the loss of Villers-Bretonneux, he ordered the nearest Australian Reserve Brigade, the 13th, billeted at Curé, Pont-Nolius, and Diels, north of Somme as Army Reserve, to march south at once to 3rd Corps, to assist in the recapture of Villers-Bretonneux, which was imperative for the security of Amiens.
General Rawlinson, as indeed he was bound to do if he was to retain Haig's confidence, insisted throughout that Villers-Bretonneux must be retaken that night at the latest, and at 11:30, while the counterattack by the Sherwood Foresters was still undelivered, he directed that General Henniker should get touch with General Hobbs of the 5th Australian Division with a view to arranging a double counterstroke, north and south of the town, to take place at 2 o'clock. After much discussion, however, it was decided to attack at day with only hurried artillery preparation. It would be highly costly, but General Henniker believed that with a full moon, the attempt might be made at night. He passed the suggestion to General Butler, who agreed. The 8th Division had also been planning a counterattack, but with the Sherwood Foresters failing to eventuate, they too dwindled. The night attack then became rather urgent.
Throughout the afternoon of the 24th of April, plans were laid, troops were moved, and generals argued over the execution of the main plan.
At 4 p.m, Brigadier General Glasgow of the 13th Australian Brigade had his plan approved by General Birdwood. The attack would begin at 10 p.m, under faint moonlight without any artillery support. Although the guns would fire support missions against the village, the railway and the monument for 1 hour after the start, then raising its fire to a line well beyond the objective, thus preventing German reinforcements counterattacking. Birdwood originally wanted a day attack but relented to his Australian brigadiers and moved to 8 p.m. This would still be light, barely half an hour after sunset, and was not suitable to Glasgow at all, whom originally wanted 10:30 p.m. Both Birdwood and Glasgow ceded a little and finally agreed on 10 p.m, which gave Glasgow time to reconnoitre the ground.
A brigade, the 54th, lent by the 18th Division to the 58th, would be advancing on Glasgow's right. On his left, after ignoring Villers-Bretonneux and passing the monument, his brigade would meet the 15th Australian Brigade, which would have advanced past the north of the town. The meeting point to be at the old British front line, 600 yards north of the railway. The Germans in the town and the Bois d'Aquin would thus be cut off, but would be mopped up by 2 battalions of the 8th Division lent to the Australian Brigadiers for the purpose. The 2nd Northamptonshire to Glasgow and the 22nd Durham Light Infantry to Elliot.
Glasgow of the 13th and Brigadier General Elliot of the 15th had some minor disagreements throughout the late afternoon, but Glasgow's stronger personality won through, and at 8 p.m, the final plan was in place with the battalion and company commanders to receive their final orders on the march to their respective departure lines.
It was 9:35, a quarter of an hour before 0 hour, when the leading companies of the 52nd had reached the Tape. They had passed large numbers of British soldiers retiring. Part of the 23rd Brigade had been ordered to withdraw and reform behind the wood. Many called to the Australians, "Jerry's coming. Give 'em hell, Aussie," said one. "They've knocked 11's rotten." The 52nd found upon its right the 7th Bedfordshire, left battalion of the 54th Brigade. On the left, the leading company of the 51st had arrived at 9:53, as the battalion was pushed into place by Lieutenant Colonel Christie, who was there ahead of it. A flare was fired by the enemy and a machine gun opened from the wood directly left of the line. Christie, who as arranged had met Lieutenant Colonel Witham of the 52nd, had agreed with him to delay the advance for 10 minutes to give the 51st time to deploy. At 10 o'clock, the British artillery opened at Villers-Bretonneux and the region near it, and the sky became rimmed with glare.
At 10:10, when the 2 front companies and support company of the 51st were in position, with the reserve company deploying behind them, and the head of the 50th Battalion in reserve just visible coming up from the rear. The word to advance was given. The wood on the left lay on the slopes descending from the Kashi Plateau. The platoon next to it, forming the left of Captain Harburn's company, was under Lieutenant Sadlier. He had been telling his men, if you hear any noise in the wood, don't get the wind up. It will only be a few Tommies cleaning up the Germans there. But the advance had hardly begun when flare after flare shot up from the trees, and a number of machine guns opened from behind the undergrowth, enfilading the line with intense fire.
Many of Harburn's company were hit. The flank troops all dropped to the ground and lay there till the flares died out, when they at once began to advance again, only to be illuminated by another sheaf of flares, and again swept by intense machine gun fire. Again they stopped, and as the machine guns completely enfiladed the line, further advance along the slope direct to the monument in accordance with orders was apparently impossible.
Sergeant Stokes and Lieutenant Sadlier from the 51st Battalion took some men and moved into the woods with a handful of grenades and a Lewis gun. At the first German pit, Sadlier was shot through the thigh by a German attempting to surrender. He was hit again at a later enemy position and forced to the rear. The German gunners were in no mood to surrender and were now firing tracer rounds, intended for anti-aircraft fire. The Western Australians could now see the phosphorus of the rounds and continued on regardless, still led by Stokes. Stokes used captured hand grenades to destroy a gun crew, took their gun and captured 2 more machine gun positions. But this audacious action, all enemy machine guns were silenced. 6 more picked up later, and a major threat to the main attack had been removed.
Sadlier and Stokes were recommended for the Victoria Cross, which was richly deserved by both. Higher authority, however, awarded it to Sadlier alone, partly in recognition of the action of the whole party, which fought with extraordinary dash. Stokes received the DCM.
The night attack prevented much of the enemy fire from being as deadly as it would have been during the day, but it also added some confusion. When shots were fired from close in front, someone said, "Bomb the bastards." A few grenades were thrown, a rush made, and the line came on a trench manned, not by Germans, but by a fragment of the 2nd Devon and 1st Worcester, who had not heard of the counterattack and thought the Germans were attacking them from the rear. By 1:05 a.m., Glasgow and Elliott at Blangy-Tronville had known that the 52nd Battalion was in touch with British troops near the monument. By 1:31, Colonel Witham of the 52nd heard that his front line was connected up with those of the 51st and of the Bedfords, but that on each flank of these no other troops were in touch. The telephone line from brigade headquarters was by then through not merely to the headquarters of Witham and Christie in Kashi Switch, but to the 52nd front line. At 3:55, Colonel Christie gave the brigade major on the telephone the approximate position of the line from a quarter of a mile to a mile short of the objective, but a mile within the recent German line and in a position to squeeze out the Germans, then in Villa Bretonneux, if the 15th Brigade reached its objective.
The 15th had indeed reached its objective, so smoothly, in fact, that all the men had been successfully reunited with their own platoons. It was not, however, as plain and easy as it sounds. Not at all. The 15th Brigade won its way to its objective by excessive use of the bayonet and sheer determination. It has been said that the screams of the Australians in the attack would have made a tribe of Red Indians green with envy. By 4 o'clock on April 25th, the 3rd anniversary of the landing at Anzac, the 2 Australian brigades had established themselves not, it is true, upon the objective set them, completely cutting off the town, but so near to it that it was certain that the enemy, unless he dislodged them, must withdraw his troops from the town and would, if indeed it was still possible for them to escape.
The Germans had been absolutely overwhelmed by the determination of the Australians, and the success of the attack was such that the French renamed several roads within the town to commemorate the Australian victory. Rue de Melbourne and Rue de Sydney being 2. Many years later, after the town had been rebuilt, the school was funded by Victorian school children, Every classroom within the school has a sign saying "Never forget Australia." After Villa Bretonneux, the Allies seized the initiative and continued their offensives, which would eventually see out the war.
The Australians, in particular, had noticed that the Germans were not as spirited in their fighting as they had been in the previous years, and after the loss of Villa Bretonneux, their spirits had ebbed further. Add to this the constant Allied artillery shelling and aircraft attacks. The not-so-gentle probing patrols were adding, quite seriously, to their problems. After attacks at Morlancourt and Villa-sur-Ancre, there was further change to the Australian Corps. After 4 years of constant battle, the Australian forces were now to be commanded by one of their own.
With the appointment of General Birdwood to command the newly formed 5th Army, Lieutenant General John Monash assumed command of the Australian Corps on the 31st of May. He was later knighted for his command at the Battle of Hamel.
The Battle of Hamel on the 4th of July 1918 was a turning point in the war, the first time Australians had fought under an Australian commander, with Americans in support and tanks used as a rolling barrage, as well as to resupply the troops. General Monash's planning had been so precise that the battle was won in 93 minutes, with less than 1,000 Australian casualties. Over 2,000 German casualties and 1,600 prisoners were taken. His plan became the blueprint for future battles. Further battles at Amiens in August, Chipley, Poitiers, Ettenhem, and Mont Saint-Quentin further cemented Monash's command and the reputation of the AIF, leading to them being used one last time as storm troops to finally breach the Hindenburg Line, previously found to be impossible, although many costly attempts had been made.
The Australians were scheduled to attack the strongly defended Hindenburg Line on a 6-kilometre wide land bridge between Bellecourt and Ventwil, where the St. Quentin Canal ran underground through a tunnel. A 2-day artillery bombardment preceded the attack. After nearly 2 months of continuous action, Australian units were numerically weak, with the average battalion having only 300 men available for action. The Australians were reinforced by keen but inexperienced American troops, whose unit strength was 3 times that of the exhausted Australians. The Americans took over the left and right sectors, with the Australian Corps in the centre. 210 Australian officers and men assisted the Americans, who were to attack the main Hindenburg Line on the ground above the tunnel and the second line 1.5 kilometres beyond. Australian soldiers would then pass through the Americans and carry the attack another 3 to 4 kilometres through the third line.
2 days before the main attack, the Americans were unsuccessful in a preliminary assault. Reports that American troops were still in front resulted in the cancellation of the creeping barrage for 29th of September. Extra tanks were allotted to the Americans, who tried to reach the starting line in order to commence the main attack on time. The 2 American divisions attacked at dawn on 29th of September in thick mist increased by smoke, but the soldiers could not find their way through the fog and were hampered also by the absence of their many officers. Those in the attack soon became casualties, and the troops, after penetrating parts of the front enemy line, were driven back or isolated and pinned down by the German counterattacks.
The Australian divisions, coming up at 9 a.m. for the second stage, came under machine gun fire from the left before the Hindenburg outpost line was reached, and on the right just beyond Bellecourt. Artillery support was at first refused because the Americans were erroneously believed to be in front. In 3 days of hard fighting with Lewis guns and grenades, the Australians captured the first 2 German lines, which had been the American objectives. On the 3rd of October 1918, Australian troops broke through the last defensive system of the Hindenburg Line, the third line. 2 days later, Australians, in a costly action, captured Montbretagne village.
These were the last infantry actions fought by the Australian soldiers on the Western Front. The 5 Australian divisions were now withdrawn for arrest and were heading up the line into battle again on the 11th of November 1918, the day the armistice was declared. The last Australians in action on the Western Front were the men of the Australian Flying Corps and some artillery units. Whilst the Australian Corps were fighting France throughout 1918, the light horse units of the Desert Mounted Corps under Lieutenant General Chauvel were mopping up in Palestine after their magnificent victory at Beersheba battles were to be fought at Tel El-Quilf, Jerusalem, Jericho, Amman, Jordan Valley, Damascus, and finally at Aleppo. As the fighting came to an end, Australia was left to come to terms with a war which had cost it more than 61,000 dead. Of these, 46,000, 75%, lay in the soil of France and Belgium, and 18,000, 39%, were never recovered for burial, or if recovered, were unidentifiable.
As the sun rises on this new day, please remember us.